Environmental monitoring in museums. My name is Megan Narvey. I'm the Outreach Conservator at the Minnesota Historical Society. Here is my contact information. I just have my email address up here because I primarily work from home. This is the best way to get in touch with me. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I have this brief summary here. I'm going to talk about why it's important to monitor your environment, although hopefully you already know why it's important to monitor your environment if you're here. I'm going to give a brief rundown of the Local History Services Equipment Loan Program just for fun, even though that's not really the subject of today's webinar. But I will talk a little bit about why grants to support monitoring work are a little bit different than the equipment loan program that we run through the Local History Services loan program. I'll talk about how to write an environmental monitoring plan and why that's an important part of any grant for environmental monitoring. And then I'll finish up by giving a brief rundown of visible light and UV meters and temperature and relative humidity data loggers, what they look like, how to pick the right tool for you, and what storage and data interpretation will look like for you when you pick one, and like a few resources for you when you're moving on from this webinar afterwards. This is not going to be a completely comprehensive guide to the subject because I'm not an expert on this. There are experts on this subject. I simply am the grant content reviewer for these projects, and I know a little bit about this subject, enough to review projects that fall into this category. I know the basics of environmental monitoring, and I can point you in the right direction of picking the right tools for your job and environmental monitoring basics. So, why monitor your environment? I'm not going to cover in detail the reasons why. Light, temperature, and relative humidity can all have profound effects on the preservation of a museum collection. I'll assume that we're all starting at the same base point, that an uncontrolled museum environment can harm the things that we're trying to preserve in many different ways. Too much light, not enough humidity, too much humidity, too warm, too cold, too many changes between warm and cold, not enough insulation in the wall that's keeping warm away from cold. All of these things can result in deterioration that we're trying to avoid. So the reason why it's important to monitor your environment is to identify any possible issues before they cause minor problems for your collection or major problems for your collection. Another reason why it's important to monitor your environment is for the grants program, the Legacy Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grants Program. Environmental monitoring reports are necessary reporting, so required documents for some grant applications or required documents for some milestone or final reports for grants that include museum lighting grants or museum HVAC grants. So it's important to know what the required documents are for the specific grant that you're applying for, but that does come up in grants when you're applying for them. Another reason it's important to monitor your environment is to ensure that your expensive new equipment is working properly. Whether or not you paid for that new equipment using a grant, or whether you found a different source of funding to pay for your new HVAC equipment or your new air conditioner, having a completely independent data logger to monitor your environment can help you make sure that your new piece of equipment is actually working properly. And you can catch any problems before your warranty period is up, for example. And another reason to monitor your environment that I really like to plug for people is that it helps you identify opportunities for increased sustainability and cost-saving measures for your organization. So One example that I like to tell people is people who have continuous light measuring tools have been able to find like times when people have been leaving on the lights, like maybe security guards have been turning on the lights in storage when they walk through and then just leaving the room and leaving the lights on overnight. They wouldn't have known otherwise. Or a library at my college, they wouldn't have like animals or like a cat walk in overnight and uh, turn on the motion sensor lights around. Anyway, it's just those are just light based options, but like having data monitoring equipment means that you can tell when increasing or decreasing the temperature a few degrees has negative, positive, or neutral effects on the humidity, and you can then save some money on controlling your environment without having any negative impact on your collection. And it's win, 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 win for everybody involved. So it's great to monitor your environment. All right, moving on to Local History Services Equipment Loan Program. So this program is available to any collecting organization in Minnesota. We don't really have any rules about who can borrow anything. We have temperature and relative humidity data loggers, and we have visible and UV light meters available. The only cost to the organization is the price of postage and insurance when you're sending it back at the end of your loan period. The loan period is 1 month, and at the end of your loan period, we'll send you an environmental report that gives you graphs of what the environment was like during your loan period, as well as a report of like breaking down what that graph means. So like explaining what all of the little dips mean, and like what it means that your temperature was this like 78 the whole time, and whether or not your RH was the right RH, or whether it was too high or too low. This is a great program. I love running it because I'm a big data nerd, and it allows me to get to look at numbers and graphs, and I get to help organizations with specific problems and get to know a lot of different people. So it's a lot of fun. I really like working with the equipment loan program. So I love recommending it to people. And the way to get a hold of any of our pieces of equipment are just to send me an email, and you can get in touch with me through either of these email addresses. I just realized that I mistyped my name and my email address in this, not my name. There's a period in between Megan and Narvey in that email address on the bottom. So use conservationhelp@mnhs.org here, and not Megan Narvey at mnhs.org if you're trying to get in touch with me. But this is the Local History Services Equipment Loan Program, and this is something that Minnesota Historical Society provides as a free service through the Local History Services office. So on the other hand, here is the Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grants Program, another service provided by the Minnesota Historical Society. We run this grants program, which comes through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. I'm going to talk about how to fund starting up your own environmental monitoring program using the legacy grants now, which is different than borrowing a environmental data logger through the Local History Services office. So in order to do this, like brief introduction to the grants program, to request an account on the grants portal, this is how you get a grant, is you have to apply through the grants portal. There's this link. Most of the time to start up an environmental monitoring program, it's going to fall in our small grant category, which is grants under $10,000. And we have these quarterly. So this is January, April, July, and October. So most of the time it will be a small grant. Occasionally, if you're starting up a really large program, you might want to apply for a large grant for an environmental monitoring program over $10,000. This will be a large grant, and that happens once per year, and a pre-application is required. And that changes, the deadline changes every year, but it's usually in the summer. And another helpful piece of information is that we have a grants open house the first Thursday of every month. And you can come to our open houses to ask us all sorts of useful questions, any sort of question about grants. So that's my 5-second spiel on the grants program. Now, we're going to talk about grants to support starting your own environmental monitoring program. So what's the difference between starting your own environmental monitoring program versus just borrowing a data logger from the local history services loan program? Well, the loan program that we run, you can only get a data logger for 1 month and then you have to return it. When you have your own environmental monitoring program, you can have as many data loggers as you want. You can have them all at the same time, and you can have them forever. So that's the difference. It's really a permanent solution for your own data logger, for your own environmental monitoring work. And it's really the next step for your museum when you're ready to move on in your preservation practice, and especially if you have, for example, collections that are stored in non-ideal storage locations, such as a basement or an attic, or you have perhaps like concerns about leaks or anything like that in your museum, and you want to have like the extra insurance of having a data logger on hand at all times to make sure that those conditions are secure, then it's worthwhile to have an environmental monitor in your museum so that you can, keep an eye on things at all times. Another good reason to have your own at all times is if you have windows in your collection, in your exhibit hall, for example, and you have regular exhibits being changed out or very precious light sensitive collections, and you want to regularly check in on how much light things are being exposed to, then it's worthwhile to have your own light meters rather than rely on borrowing from time to time. So there are lots of reasons to have your own rather than rely on borrowing, because the loan program is really limited. It's really a great option for those who are thinking of dipping their feet into environmental monitoring and not somebody who is ready to take the plunge into full-time collection environmental monitoring and preservation. So starting up your own environmental monitoring program. The eligible project here is described specifically in the grants manual on page 52. It's described as the purchase and setup of environmental data loggers or light meters and the creation of environmental monitoring plan. There are no required documents or attachments for this application. And I have a couple of pieces of advice for a successful application. They are, why is this project a priority for you right now? What exactly do you plan to achieve? So we really like to see in your applications the specific information about what you're gonna do. So how many data loggers are you gonna buy and where are you gonna put them? That's the kind of information we like to see in your application. And then how will you ensure long-term sustainability is a really key part of this kind of project. And the reason why is really tied into the creation of the environmental monitoring plan. And sustainability is really tied into the environmental monitoring plan. And that's why the environmental monitoring plan is included in the eligible project. And let me tell you more about that. Uh-oh. All right. In order to receive a grant for environmental monitoring equipment, your project has to include time spent creating an environmental monitoring plan. And you don't need to have this plan in place up front. It can be part of the overall project. And here's why. Data loggers are completely useless if nobody is using the data. They cannot help you preserve your museum collection on their own. It's not like an HVAC system working passively in the background. If you're not using the data, if you're not actively looking at it and using it, they are just gathering dust. The purpose of the environmental monitoring plan is to codify the use of the data loggers and the light meters to make it more likely that this is a long-term commitment for your museum, your organization, and that the equipment will continue to be used in the future, even in the event of staff turnover. So this is really hard because you don't know what the future is going to hold, and it's easy to make like sweeping statements now about like, I'm going to look at this every single week because this is fascinating and important, and it's so cool to have these brand new pieces of like cool gear. But it's just not going to be sustainable long term. And so having an environmental monitoring plan that really specifically lays out what all of this information is going to look like in the future is a key part of any grant project for environmental monitoring. So here's the information that I want to see in an environmental monitoring plan. Who is in charge of monitoring the museum environment? Where are the data loggers stored and or placed? And this can include information like, how do you open the case that the data logger is in? Where is the key? When and how is the data being reviewed? And this can be like every 6 months or something. It doesn't have to be once a week or every day. How is the data being stored long-term and shared with others? There should be some sort of plan for preservation of the data. And also, if there is staff turnover, how will this information be shared? How will the environmental monitoring plan be shared? All right. So there's my spiel on that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about meters themselves, the real fun part about this presentation. So I'm going to start with visible light and UV meters. So visible light meters measure visible light. Here on these 2 meters, you can see that the little white bulb thing is what's measuring the light. These meters only measure visible light and not UV, and that makes them a little bit more affordable. The ballpark price for these kind of meters is a couple $100s. Moving on, this little gadget looks similar, but it's actually an add-on piece to a data logger, like a temperature and relative humidity data logger. The previous 2 that I showed you are spot checkers, whereas this add-on piece is a continuous light monitoring system. So a spot checker is what we see more frequently in museum use traditionally for light meters. To use a spot checker, you just hold it in the location where you want to see the light level, you turn it on, and then you write down the light level on a piece of paper or on your computer, and then you move on to the next location and you do the same thing. With a continuous light meter, you install it in the location where you want it to be, and you leave it there, and it records the data over long periods of time. So here's like a high and a low price for you, high and low tech kind of on light monitors, 2 very different strategies, just to give you the full range of possibilities. On the left, we have sort of like the gold standard of light meters in museums. It covers visible light and ultraviolet light, and it's very accurate. It costs about $2,500. On the right, this is a traditional light sensitivity test that I love called the Blue Wool Fading Card. This only costs $25, and I love them. They're limited in their use, but I'll explain how it works anyway. Each of the little stripes is a textile dyed with a blue colorant that fades at a different rate because they're each sensitive to light at a different sensitivity level. So the top ones are the most sensitive to light, and on the bottom, they're the least sensitive to light. So you put them next to each other, and one of them is covered up and one of them is exposed to light. And over a set period of time, you can see by how much they fade how much light they've been exposed to, because it's the cards they conform to international standards. So you can use the amount that they've faded to assess how much light the cards have been exposed to. So here's an example of the cards after use. You can see like the first strip is completely bleached. It's really cool. I'm getting carried away. Let's move on. The cards are not super practical for use anymore. The light meter on the left is extremely useful because it provides both visible light and ultraviolet light readings, which none of the other light meters that I've shown you did. So here's some information for you. How to pick a tool. The question you have to ask yourself is, of course, why do you need a light meter? Do you want something that can spot check, or do you want something that can perform continuous light monitoring? Do you want to know how often Bob Dylan's baby bonnet is being exposed to light under that automatic light sensor that responds to movement? Or do you want to compare how much UV is coming through the UV window film once per year so that you know when it's time to replace it? That's an example of asking yourself why you need a light meter. Think about whether you want one light meter that can be easily moved from one space to another space, or whether you want to monitor many like different exhibit areas simultaneously. Obviously, cost and ease of use are both factors. You don't need a grant to pay for a $25 blue wool card, but they're also much more difficult to interpret. Finally, consider the need to test for UV. It's much less expensive to purchase a light meter that only measures visible light intensity without measuring UV. Now give me a second to climb up onto my soapbox. I've included a little diagram here that illustrates the three components of the electromagnetic spectrum that us museum nerds need to know about, and I promise I won't use the words electromagnetic spectrum again. Visible light is the component of light that we see. Infrared is a lower energy component that we can feel as heat. That's why incandescent light bulbs get so hot. And ultraviolet light is a higher energy component that we can't see and we can't feel until it causes damage. Because it has higher energy than visible light, it causes worse damage. It comes from the sun, it comes from incandescent and fluorescent light bulbs, and occasionally it even comes from some LED bulbs. So if you're dealing with really significant light-sensitive collections, if you have big windows or fluorescent lights, then you should definitely be looking for a light meter that can test for UV. All right, I'm climbing off the soapbox. Storing and interpreting light data. I'm not going to cover continuous light monitoring data in great detail, except to know that whatever piece of equipment you buy will probably come with its own software that you can use, as far as I know. For spot checking, you can use a simple spreadsheet or even a paper form like this. It doesn't have to be super fancy, but you should be saving your data so that you compare it. You can compare it against itself over time. All right, moving on to temperature and relative humidity tools. So here's a little spiel I have about thermostats. Why can't you just use like a thermostat and a pen and paper like we did for light? Thermostat accuracy isn't always going to be great. Or like thermostat, I'm also using as like a stand-in for you have a new HVAC system. It's great. It gives its own temperature and relative humidity readings itself using its building system. So why can't you just use those readings and not get your own environmental monitoring equipment? Well, it's great to get your own independent system for monitoring your environment. You can trust the accuracy of a calibrated, independent system better than you can trust the system that's tied into your HVAC. We can get a more complete picture of the environmental conditions when we can put them in various locations all around your building. If you are just like going in and checking your thermostat and writing down the number a few times a day, you don't know what's happening at night when you're not there. You don't know what's happening inside your display cases or your storage cabinets, and you're not adequately protecting your collections against disaster scenarios like mold growth. One of the cool things about modern data logger systems is that they can send alerts to like your phone if it automatically detects relative humidity levels that are at a certain point that's like concerning to you. So the modern systems are very smart, as I'm sure you can imagine, and they have modern capabilities that the old systems didn't have, and they're better able to protect your collections than a pen and paper system. So moving on. Now that I just spoke the praise of the modern smart tools that we have, I'm going to talk about briefly singing the praises of the old analog systems. Just for fun, there's a long history of analog temperature and relative humidity measuring tools. Here's a brief selection. You might have these in your museum from the olden days. What's nice about these tools is that many of them are highly accurate. The black and yellow one is called a sling hygrometer, or in the UK where I went to grad school, it was called the whirling hygrometer, which is very fun because you spin it around to check the relative humidity, and it is extremely accurate. There are also, many of them are very easy to calibrate, whereas digital relative humidity and temperature tools now are extremely complicated to calibrate. You have to send them in. All of these tools need to be calibrated every so often to maintain their accuracy, and it's really hard to do it now. But anyway, all of these old analog tools, they have limited uses now, but I don't want you to throw them away because many of them are they still have great uses, and also they're very fun to use. So keep them around if you have them, and if you don't want them anymore, send them to me because I love them. Anyway, at least let me know because I can tell you why they're useful to have. Here are some examples of modern temperature and relative humidity data loggers that you're likely to buy if you are looking to install an environmental monitoring system now. These are examples of modern, like what modern data logger systems look like. They're not the only systems that are out there. It's common these days to find data logger systems that measure temperature, relative humidity. Dew point is a common measurement that these ones will measure, and also light is more and more common. All of these three here measure light in addition to all of those other measurement tools that I said before. What you're really looking for in an environmental data logger is temperature and relative humidity. the bread and butter of understanding your museum environment, but dew point is also very useful. I have on the slide some examples of like modern data loggers that you'll see frequently in museums. They include models by Conserve, Testo, Lascar, and Hobo. You'll see if you Google these companies that they all transmit information differently. One of them on the bottom here still uses the USB port to download data from the data logger onto like a laptop, but the rest of them use Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or something that's called a low power wide area network. And it transmits the data, all of those transmit the data wirelessly to your computer or your phone. Usually, once you get the data, you can choose to access it using a proprietary software or an app on your phone. And then you can download the data. Usually, you can download the data as something called a CSV file, which is just like a data dump file. And you can open those using spreadsheets usually. So these, again, are examples of data loggers that also measure light. Continuous light monitoring, which I mentioned before, is it will measure the light in a fixed location constantly. This is a relatively new feature, at least for me, so I can't say how well it works. I can't say how buggy it is compared to the more traditional light monitoring tools that I talked about. It's not that long ago that it was a standard practice for data loggers to go and find them every month and download the data onto a USB thumb drive. And now that might as well be a Stone Age practice. You don't do that anymore. These tools now are very low maintenance. The technology is updating all the time. So that's why I said at the beginning of the webinar that I'm not an expert, because it does feel like the technology is updating constantly and it's hard to keep up with. So this is what I know about them, is what I've shared, and there are going to be people who know a lot more about it than I do. So storing and interpreting data. This here is what CSV data looks like, but I just mentioned the big data. It's a lot of raw data, which you can scroll and scroll and scroll through. Like I said, most data loggers these days are going to come with its own software that you can download on your phone and your computer, and it will automatically format this data for you into something that's more readable. But if you don't like the software, you can also do it yourself by downloading the CSV data and opening it in a spreadsheet. You can open the data in Excel or Google Sheets and format it into line graphs. That's what this is. So here's an example with the data uploaded into a Google Sheet and then quickly plotted into a line graph. You can visualize the data. I get it, though, that playing with spreadsheets is some people's nightmare. And interpreting all of this data, even when you can see it in a graph, is also challenging. So I have another tool to share with you that I use all the time. I use it for my local history services loan program. And so I wanted to share it with you guys. It's called eClimate Notebook. This program is free software for your museum if you have 3 or fewer data loggers. It does cost money if you have more than 3, and it provides more features as well if you pay money for it. It's available online through your web browser, so you can access it anywhere. It's provided by the Image Permanence Institute, which is run by the Rochester Institute of Technology, and we use it to manage dozens of data loggers at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I have access to a professional membership, not just the free membership. So use that information as you will, but because it is free, I wanted to share it with you. It's very useful and it's used by many museums. So here's how it looks. There's a data manager tab where you upload your data. That's the red arrow there. And once you have uploaded your data, there's the graphs tab, and this is what the graphs look like. It automatically formats the graphs, and then this bar on the side shows like all of the different options for like how you can like format the data by temperature and relative humidity scale, and the Calendar, you want like the date range shown. And then this is where eClimate Notebook really shines, as it provides a lot of analysis data for you. And I don't have time to get into what all of these numbers and figures means, but eClimate Notebook does provide the meaning for all of these terms, and I'm happy to share more information about it with you if you're interested. But it provides, like, as you can see, this risk summary statement where it says, like, natural aging, good. Mold risk, good. That means low mold risk. Metal corrosion, good. Low mold metal corrosion risk. It has something called the TWPI, which means time weighted preservation index, which is 95 here. The other thing I really like about it is that it provides you with your average temperature and your standard deviation for temperature for a time period. So that gives you your, like, for, like, if you're analyzing a month of data, it automatically gives you, like, your average temperature for that month was 66 degrees plus or minus 4 degrees, and it gives you that automatically, which is really nice. It automatically helps you interpret your data for you. And this is really helpful, really useful data analysis for you. And all of this is provided for you through the free version if you have 3 or fewer data loggers again. So I wanted to share that with you. All right, so here are the resources that I have for you. There's a really useful written guideline on monitoring temperature and relative humidity through the Northeast Document Conservation Center. Always recommend the National Park Service Museum Handbook for more guidance, a link to eClimate Notebook, and then this webinar, What's Best for My Collection, New Approaches to Environmental Monitoring, came out in 2021. So that was only 2 years ago, not very long ago. And here is my contact information and a very funny comic strip. I will now take questions. Hi, Paul. I can't hear you. Okay. Paul says that Onset Hobo has Bluetooth light meters for $85 that continuously record visible light, which is another option that I didn't share. That is very cool to know.
Hey, Megan, with the with Paul's mention of this meter that just does visible light, and I know you talk about the differences between measuring for UV and visible light, but I wonder if you can just expand on it a little bit. Like when somebody is thinking about producing this plan, and while they might think that they have UV light sort of taken care of with filters on windows and things like that, but those things do degrade over time. What would you think of a plan that only did look to monitor visible light? Would you have suggestions for that?
If I mean, it depends on the context. So if it was a museum that had, say, brand new UV film on the windows and they were just looking to measure the amount of visible light, like if they had, say, an annual plan to borrow a UV light meter from local history services to check on the status of the UV film, that could be sufficient check-in on the UV to make sure that UV film was still working. I think it's important for museums to know that the UV film isn't like a permanent solution. It doesn't last forever. Well, people will probably figure that out when it starts crumbling off of their windows, but it does stop working before that also.
Thanks. Yeah, when you mentioned in there about how even LED lights, at a certain point can emit, maybe I understood that even they can occasionally emit some level of UV light, which was news to me.
Some of them do. It depends on the LED bulb, which was also news to me when I found that out. I haven't seen it happen yet in a museum, though, so I wonder if it's like certain colors of LED bulb, and they're not the kind of colors that museums are likely to install in like their exhibit halls.
Maybe UV lights that were bit by a radioactive spider or something. But
John?
So Paul had another comment. We can get to that. I guess. So my question is, so I know there's some organizations that did testing in their collections for things like arsenic, particularly on taxidermy, and it's environmental monitoring of collections. Is it possible to catch that sort of material or to record, some sort of outgassing from, toxic collections?
Interesting. I didn't talk about like pollution monitoring in museums, but that is like one aspect of environmental monitoring in museums is pollutant monitoring, but that wouldn't include like heavy metals like arsenic, because they don't tend to be like in the air because they're heavy, so they tend to settle. The sort of things that would be like pollutants in the air would be like more like organic vapors from, I don't know, like plywood or even like formaldehyde, things like that.
Yeah.
That's another thing Paul probably has comments on. He's like,
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, it was a little button I had to find. Yeah, that's a little bit above even the MNHS. So there was one project that was done where outside company was the testing company was contracted to do that kind of monitoring for several months. There's a few in town, analytical chemistry companies. So if you have a major problem, say a sick building syndrome or something, you could possibly talk to the grants people for that. He'd probably walk you through that. That would be a specific project. In terms of do it yourself, there are some tools for that. It's low tech. The AD, Megan, you probably know the AD strips that Image Permanence Institute has. That's used. In fact, the latest Journal of the AIC has a really good article from the Alaska State Museum on low tech monitoring and scientific conservation. So take a look at that. That would be a good resource to get out there. And Ellen Carley wrote it, and she talks about using AD strips. And actually, I used to use those for testing case materials, like you said, plywood and that kind of thing. Those are better in like measuring a confined space. But you can use them in an open area to see if there's anything. But they detect acetic acid in particular. So that's one thing. You could also use metal coupons for that type of thing. And then so that's more like canary in the coal mine. And then from there, if you see, okay, it looks like we've got a problem, then you can go further and design a study using more sophisticated equipment that you can either rent or have somebody come in and do that.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Well, one more quick thing. There are monitors, and Hobo has them for CO2, which is considered a pollutant, and that's also tied into room occupancy and HVAC systems and all that. So that's something to consider as well.
Paul, do you want to read out your comment from 2:45 p.m.?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was just going to add on that you showed the Hobo and the the Lascar monitor, that USB, and I use those when doing consulting. If possible, I'll send them to the museum a couple of months ahead of the assessment just to get some continuous data. And they're pretty easy to use, and their software is, I think, pretty good, for a limited number of loggers. But it gives you similar statistics to the eClimate Notebook. And the main advantage of eClimate Notebook, which I still use when I can, is it's really good over the long term for managing multiple locations, even up to 3. And you could pull their reports into your own custom report for managers and curators. So that's the main advantage of that. But those standalone ones, the Hobo has really improved its software on the phone app, and Lascar is also an online app that you plug into when you download the logger.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for coming and sharing your advice.
Yeah, no problem.
And Todd asked about resources for placement and spacing of monitors. I think that the NEDCC resource on monitoring temperature and relative humidity has some feedback on that. And definitely the National Park Service Museum Handbook would have some information on that.
Yeah, and if you have a facilities, depending on the size of museum, a facilities department, it's helpful to work with them, and to get them involved too. So it's not an us and them type thing. It's, dueling data or anything like that. It's like a team approach. So they'll have input on where to put it, especially if you're working with an HVAC system. Or even with the contractor, that if it's a new system, to troubleshoot during the warranty period where they think it would be good to put that. And just as an example, in the History Center, we had some right by the thermostat and humidistat in the galleries. That's what the facilities engineer wanted, to double check their stuff, and plus other locations. But that was their request for that. So that gives you one idea, one example.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Please get in touch if you have any other questions.